Hi, this is Kevin Jennings. I'm the CEO of Lambda Legal, and I welcome you to From Fear to Fighting Back, our regular program in which we speak with the leaders of the movement for equality for LGBTQ people and everyone living with HIV. It gives me tremendous pleasure today to introduce you to Andy Marra, the Executive Director of the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, or TLDEF. TLDEF is committed to ending discrimination based upon gender identity and expression, and to achieving equality for transgender people through public education, test case litigation, direct legal services, and public policy efforts. I've had the extraordinary pleasure of knowing and working with Andy for almost 2 decades, back to when she was a student leader with the organization I founded, GLSEN. I not only had the chance to work with Andy at GLSEN, but also at the Arcus Foundation, the world's largest private funder of LGBTQ rights, where I was the executive director and Andy worked in our communications shop. And having known Andy for nearly 20 years, I am going to say something, which is that I always knew she was going to do great things. So I am thrilled to welcome her today and to thank her for her leadership at TLDEF. Now, despite being, in my book at age 57, a very young person, Andy, you have been in this movement for many years. And as you said, you've been in a variety of roles: GLAAD, GLSEN, the Arcus Foundation, TLDEF. You've run for office. You've served on the board of Freedom for All Americans. How have things in the movement changed for trans people from when you first got involved back when you were in your high school GSA 20 years ago?
Our movement was at a place where trans issues were still somewhat invisible, and the trans community faced a great deal of erasure in talking about how our movement forms the agenda that we all collectively advance. And I think about the times of when activists across the spectrum were divided because of ENDA, and the fact that trans people were excluded from ENDA, or the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And kind of fast forward to today, and we have a movement that's resoundingly united in the value that we don't leave anyone behind, and everyone needs to be included in comprehensive non-discrimination protections that we're largely advancing through support of the Equality Act. So I think a lot has happened in a relatively short period of time. And I think because of the fact that our movement has made so many gains, I think that in such a short period of time, I can't wait to see what the next 20 years lie in store for us.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you see as the key challenges we're still facing, and how you think we should attack them.
Well, I think that there's a few challenges facing trans and non-binary people across the country. We still live in a country where there is no federal law that protects trans people writ large, in everything from public accommodations to education. I mean, there's just no federal law that on the books explicitly says that in the United States, discrimination is illegal based off of gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, both of us run legal advocacy organizations, and there's precedent that protects trans and LGBTQ plus people, especially with the win with Bostock this past summer. But the fact of the matter is, we need a federal law to settle this once and for all, and make sure that LGBTQ plus equality is the law of the land.
I think that it probably speaks to the depth of the problem that the American Medical Association last year declared that violence against trans people in America was an epidemic. When the AMA is defining something as an epidemic, you know you have a problem. And it's really appalling that the Trump administration fueled that problem.
And it's not because of one particular person. This is, in my view, a well-coordinated, well-funded effort that goes beyond one particular administration. I think about especially the legal attacks on our community and knowing the kinds of actors, our opponents, that continue to challenge hard-fought gains that we've secured over the past several years, pre-Trump. I look at the Heritage Foundation, I look at the Alliance Defending Freedom, I look at the Beckett Fund, I look at these groups, and they are actively working against our interests. And it's vital for us to not only stay informed about what our opposition is doing, but continue to push back in new and creative ways against this well-coordinated effort, not just carried out by the one particular administration, but by a movement that is actively attacking us and is in it for the long term.
I think what you just said is so important, Andy. I think that a lot of folks are breathing a sigh of relief right now because of the presidential election, but our opponents aren't going anywhere, and they're not going to stop their attacks. And they're going to leverage the fact that we have a judiciary now where 3 of 9 Supreme Court justices were appointed by Donald Trump, and over 30% of federal judges currently serving were appointed by Donald Trump. I think the judicial branch is going to see continued attacks, regardless of who the president is. And I'm wondering if you have any perspective on that.
Absolutely. I mean, in kind of building off of what you just laid out, there are 2 examples that come to mind. One, there's the Trump appointee, Kyle Duncan. Judge Duncan is in the appellate court. And prior to being appointed to the bench, he was a litigator, and he actively litigated on very high level cases that occurred, ranging from the Gavin Grimm case to HB2. He was actively involved in efforts to undermine protections for LGBTQ people, particularly trans folks. And in looking at his time on the bench already, there was a trans woman that approached the court so she could be recognized with her preferred pronouns and her preferred name, her true name. And even though it was non-binding, Judge Duncan wrote an opinion that essentially said, I don't have to recognize your true name or your preferred pronouns. I just don't have to. And I think it's just a smack in the face to someone who is, not only a trans person, but a trans person who's incarcerated, and simply asking a judge to respect their dignity. There is a conservative tilt in the courts, and there is even, I think, a greater need, not just for us to keep our eyes on the courts, but to actively engage judges and the courts in educating folks in courtrooms about the lived experiences of trans people.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of trans people who are incarcerated, because it gives me an excuse to ask you about a landmark settlement that TLDEF just won in August on behalf of incarcerated trans people. Can you tell us a little bit about that case and what happened and why it's so important?
Sure. So our client, Jenna Faith, who is a trans woman and a trans veteran, lives in a rural southern tier county in New York State. So she lives in Steuben County, and she was incarcerated. And in that experience, not only was she housed in a facility with men, when in fact she was a woman, she also, was subject to incidents of discrimination, sexual harassment, and abuse, and she was denied access to medically necessary care. So we brought a suit against Steuben County, and this past August, we announced a settlement with Steuben County that essentially resulted in the county adopting one of the most progressive policies for trans people who are incarcerated. It covers everything from making sure that trans people and non-binary people are housed in the correct facilities, making sure that jail and prison staff respect a person's self-identified gender identity when it comes to use of pronouns and names, everything from access to affirming attire and toiletries, and also being able to access medically necessary care for their transition. It was really exciting to see a rural county adopt this policy And it also serves as a model for other localities across the country and how to make sure that even in prisons and jails, trans people are treated with dignity and respect.
Now, and I know that the Name Change Project is a key part of TLDEF's work. Can you explain to people who maybe are not as familiar with this, why this is so important that people be called by the names they wish to be called?
So the Name Change Project at TLDEF exists to assist primarily low-income trans and non-binary folks across the country with legally changing their name to help increase their access to safety and their access to opportunity. And let me explain what that means. Every time we go out in the world, maybe not during COVID, but every time we go out in the world, we not only introduce ourselves to new people, but we also, in many cases, whether we're going to apply for a job, whether we're going to a doctor's office, or even if we're going out to enjoy a night on the town, we often have to provide an identification that says our name and provides our gender marker. And when trans and non-binary people do not have their true names reflected on their legal identification, oftentimes it places them in incidents of, I think at best, scrutiny by other people and uncomfortable questions, but at worst it can lead to violence or discrimination. For trans and non-binary people, particularly the folks in our community that we serve, many of whom are low income, over 60% of our participants that go through the Name Change Project live essentially on less than $1,000 a month. Over 60% of our participants identify as trans folks of color. It can be a harrowing experience to try to legally change your name. There are legal fees, filing fees, court fees, and they can add up. And it ranges from, $100 to as expensive as $3,000. And when you're a trans person that is essentially in survival mode, may not have stable housing, may be accessing public benefits for their day-to-day needs, $3,000 is an incredibly expensive proposition to legally change your name. So the work that we do in terms of our legal services through the Name Change Project not only meets an essential survival need among those most vulnerable in the trans community, but it also serves, I think, for us, and when we think about systemic change, as the starting point for what are the needs on the ground and how can we, as advocates and attorneys, seek to change policies or seek to change laws or advance precedent that actually meets the lived experiences of trans people across the country.
The new Biden-Harris administration will take office in January. If you were to provide them with a wish list, like your first 100 days, this is what you need to do for trans people, what would you tell them?
I think the first order of business in the first 100 days is to undo all of the harm that was caused through executive orders, and to take a really close look across all of the federal agencies about the damage that's been done either through rules or regulations. It's really wonky. I think it's really in the weeds, but that's where we have seen the most damage done, and that requires a lot of investment, I think, in the first few months to at least reset as close as we can to where our country was and our federal government was before Trump took office. I also think too, we need to reverse the trans military ban. This was something that came up during the Trump administration and is something that continues to affect thousands of openly serving trans service members across the country, where they're able to live in their truths and come out and also make sure that their country has their backs when they have demonstrated such a dedication to their country. And then I think finally, because there is such a receptivity to working with our organizations, and I think that it is safe to say that the administration continue to keep open lines of communication with our organizations so that way we have a seat at the table and can inform policy. I don't think this is about lobbying per se. I think this is really about a true partnership and not only undoing the damage that was caused, but really working together and finding solutions that not only restore protections that may have been chipped away, but really think about our future and what that future may look like.
Andy, this is a Trans Week of Remembrance, which grew out of the movement to establish Trans Day of Remembrance many years ago. What does this week mean to you, and why do you think it's so important that our community observe it?
I think in every community, there is a need for rituals and practices that ground us and remind us of our lived experiences and the importance of the work that we do as a movement. And, you know, there's differing points of view on the Trans Day of Remembrance. In fact, some folks are calling it the Trans Day of Resilience, to pivot away from the focus on violence. But I think the Trans Day of Remembrance or Resilience, however you wish to cast it, is significant in that it is a reminder to the world that trans people face and continue to face extraordinary levels of harassment and discrimination, but most importantly, violence. And if you look at the stories, the documented stories of trans folks that we have lost, I think the exception to the rule is that, you know, trans people often die in really heinous and cruel ways. And it ranges from being, you know, we've heard stories about trans people being strangled. We've heard stories about trans people being stoned, stabbed repeatedly, run over. And it speaks to the level of misunderstanding and hostility towards us as human beings. It could be an offhanded comment. It could be opposing a piece of legislation in your local community or in your state. But I think it's an opportunity for us to, as a country, remind ourselves that trans people are dying at disproportionate rates, that trans people are somehow viewed as less than, and that there is a responsibility in our country to find ways to not just quell the violence, but bring trans people into our communities wherever we live and create open and welcoming spaces where trans people can just go about their business and live their lives.
Well, thank you, Andy. I want to say in closing that it has been truly an honor and a pleasure to work with you for nearly 2 decades. I love having you as a colleague in the legal movement for LGBTQ equality and that of people living with HIV. And I am inspired and in awe of you. And I'm going to start crying. And I love you so much. So thank you.
Well, here's to another 20 years, Kevin.